I'm going to speak about a subject that I've done research on for about 20 years. When I started this work, it wasn't very popular. In fact, quite a lot of people thought that this was an issue, a topic that economists in particular should not be concerned with, because what matters really, or so economists thought at least, is that we have economic development as measured by GDP per capita terms. And if we have that, the distribution of this growth doesn't matter. Or, it's at least of second order importance. Now it turns out that over time, this topic has become more popular. And in fact, I think it's fair to say that over the past 10 years at least, there's been a pretty marked shift in how economists speak about this subject, and for sure in terms of how much attention it gets. And I don't know very much about you in terms of your background. I tried to look through what you've done, etc. So this makes it difficult to prepare a speech like this. Because to some of you, what I say may be very trivial. I apologize for that. I find myself, though, that quite often it's good to remind yourself about very basic things, because it sharpens our ability to sort of get to the really center of things. So, in some sense, what I'm going to speak about is trivial, but behind it, I think there's a lot of deep, important questions about society and how we should organize society. So let me start. This is a picture just to illustrate that there's a lot of debate about these things. The picture with all the books there is actually a photo of my couch in my office. That's what was lying around there. And it turns out that there's inequality in almost each title of the books, just haphazardly spread out there. There's also a couple of front pages from the British magazine The Economist, which is known to be one of these very hardcore sort of we care about growth only papers, and certainly not known for its sort of social democratic values, quite the opposite. And what's interesting is that on the cover of The Economist over the past 10, 15 years, there's been quite a few like these ones where they note, because you can think many things about left and right in terms of political attitudes, but one thing that The Economists and many others like the OECD and the IMF have noted over the past 10, 15 years or so is that you cannot really close your eyes to the fact that development recently seems to be very uneven. So this raises a question which, first of all, is what is inequality? All of these titles have inequality in them. There's a lot of talk about inequality, a lot of sentiment and strong feelings about inequality, but very rarely is it really specified what we mean by inequality and why this is of concern. So let me go back and just use an old quote I'll read it out to those of you who can't see maybe in the back. The two greatest ends of economic inquiry seems to me to be the furnishing of general answers to the two questions. First, why whole communities are rich and poor, and secondly, why inside each community some individuals and families are above and others below the average. Now, this is a cumbersome way of saying that at the heart of economics are two questions. Why, when we look across the world, are some countries successful and others seem not to be? And secondly, within each country, why are some people successful and others not, or less so? And these two questions, I think, both deserve answers. And the first one has certainly been a key topic. And I guess my colleague Torbjörn Becker was here before. I bet he showed you a lot of graphs of GDP developments. Did he? Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah? Okay, good. And we sort of look at these pictures with the assumption that this is a good thing. And I think it is. But we also need to specify a bit what this development, how it's distributed within countries, both across and within countries. And what I'm going to try to do here is to give you some basic facts about this. So I'll first talk a little bit about sort of these basic notions of what we might mean by inequality and how it relates to measurement of GDP. And secondly, a little bit about the development of this both within and across countries. Okay? And by the way, I should add also that, you know, despite the format, which entails this simultaneous translation, which I might say I'm very impressed by the people doing this. But please, if you have any questions, don't be shy. Ask questions as we go. And hopefully there will be time towards the end as well. But please, this format, it's not supposed to be static, right? So okay, let's begin with a couple of matters about the definition of inequality. Like when we speak of inequality, inequality in itself is a word which, you know, across languages has more or less of a normative feel to it. It's more or less tied to ideas about justice. But in itself, it really means that something is not evenly distributed, right? It's unequal. Now, it doesn't say per se that this is fair or unfair. It doesn't in itself say anything about justice. It could be just a description, right? Across these rooms, people have different length. We're unequal in length, right? That's just a fact. I'm guessing we're unequal in terms of age. So anything, we could be unequal in any kind of dimension. And to speak of inequality in itself is just a statement about how this looks, right? But since we're here talking about economic inequality, we're typically talking about inequality in terms of money. Now that money in itself could also be different things. So it could be inequality in wealth, or inequality in access to resources in some other way. So say that a government provides schooling for children, which otherwise you would have to pay for yourself. Now, this is an intervention, even though we're so used to this being a fact of life everywhere these days. It certainly wasn't, say, 200 years ago. But in principle, inequality in money terms or access to resources is a difficult thing to measure simply because we need to decide on what to include in this measure. We can also make distinctions between what is the market outcome, so to speak. What is the inequality in wages across individuals who work? Or we can look at how this is different after taxes and transfers, after a government has intervened somehow and taken money from some in taxation and given to some as, you know, redistributive transfers. We also need to decide on across who we're interested in this issue over. Is it across families or households, or is it across individuals? Quite often, if you look at, say, UN or OECD statistics of inequality globally, almost all of this is inequality across households, right? So you basically assume that everyone who lives together, you pool their resources and then you divide it by the number of people in the household. So this is assuming that everyone in the household shares equally, right? So this is not necessarily the case. So inequality between men and women, for example, doesn't exist in that kind of calculation, because we simply assume that men and women share this money equally in households. Now, that may or may not be true, but it's important to understand that that's how the calculation is made, and it makes a huge difference depending on what kind of issue you're studying if you think that households share money equally or if they don't, for example. Okay? We need to decide over what kind of period we're looking at inequality. Is it inequality today, like a couple of days before at least I get my paycheck? I have no money. It's always at an end just before payday. Does that mean I'm poor? No, not necessarily. But it would if we measure it just today. I'm extremely poor today. But it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm poor overall, right? So if we average this out over a month, then things look a little bit better. If we average this over a year, which is the most common measure of measuring this over a year, then we get one kind of picture. But this is also not obvious that this is the most relevant aspect or time dimension. Because if you're a student, for example, and you're investing in your education, you may be very poor measured over those years when you're a student, but then this investment pays back, so measured over your lifetime, things again look much better. So this is one thing that a lot of people quarrel about. How should we look at this, and should we measure inequality cross-sectionally by year or month, or should we look at longer periods in terms of how people live? Okay. I'm guessing, you know, I could go on like this for hours and hours and talk about different ways of measuring this. I'm hoping that I made the basic point that before you start talking about inequality, you should, or even when you read about inequality, you should think and be aware of the different ways in which you can measure this and pay attention to how exactly it's measured. Because, as I will show in a bit, this matters quite a lot for the picture that you can paint of what's going on. Okay. Now, I said I wanted to go back to being very basic and to relating this to the idea of GDP and the economy as a whole, right? So, really, if you think of an abstract illustration of what the economy looks like, at any point in time, no matter when we start, we can describe the population at any point in time as being endowed with resources, broadly speaking, with opportunities, right? So some people have education, they have certain skills, they may have money to start with. Now this situation, in this situation, economists imagine people looking forward, thinking about, okay, given the situation now, what can I do? What actions will I take? And also, based on this opportunity set, economists think of this as being a point where understanding the future payoff of different actions that you can take, this will matter for what people decide to do. Okay? And this ultimately will determine the distribution of resources and consumption and savings opportunities in the future. So if we go back and look at national accounts, how many here are familiar with the structure of national accounts? Hands up. I'm doing this just to check if the translation thing is happening at all, or if you're just, listening to Spotify or something. How many people know about national accounts? How many people know about national accounts even in the simplest form? Okay. Good. Then this is not too simple, at least in terms of too basic. So when economists measure GDP, we try to basically sum up the value of all activity in society and give it a monetary value. Okay? And the sum of all these activities is measured as GDP. Now this measurement in itself is full of problems, right? I'm the first one to admit that this is by no means a perfect measure of anything. Most economists understand this. It's not that we are completely stupid and think that this captures everything. But given that this in public discussions is given quite a lot of weight, it's important to understand that this is the way we try to capture value. Now this value is the basis of all income, right? All income that is distributed in terms of wages and in terms of capital income comes from this GDP measure. So GDP, each year, something is produced. A number of international dollars worth of activity is produced, and people are paid either in terms of capital income or in terms of wages. Now the question is, how is that value distributed across the population? That's the basic, sorry. So that's kind of the market outcome. Then governments typically intervene and they tax and they redistribute and people are left with what's called disposable incomes. That's what they have for consumption and savings in the end. And that, in turn, gives the initial distribution for the next period. Okay? So in terms of the different kinds of distribution that we might talk about, we can discuss the distribution of wealth, which is the distribution of initial resources or capital holdings. We can discuss the distribution of market outcomes, which is in some sense related to the initial wealth distribution, because wealth, when invested, pays off and gives capital incomes to those who own capital. And depending on what governments do in terms of interventions, this and taxation and redistribution, this determines what people have in the end. Now, I want you to recall this picture because it's going to come back in the end in a somewhat different form when discussing, why is this important? Why do we care about this? So let me first give you a few pictures of this sort of overall relationship between GDP per capita and development, and why economists spend so much time talking about GDP average development. Well, it's simply because there are good reasons. When you look across countries, over history, across the world, there seems to be a very strong relationship between average economic development and things that we care about. So, well, you could say, of course, that we care about money, but we don't care about money per se, right? We care about what money can bring to us individually and to society. So we care about things like being alive. So this example shows GDP per capita levels and mortality rates or life expectancy rates in the year 1800. Each little dot there is a country, and average life expectancy was order of magnitude 35 or so at that point. Now, that's the same picture in 2012. And what in particular I want to highlight here is that it's very closely related to overall development levels, how long people are expected to live in general. So if you do this kind of exercise for just about any kind of measure of health or education or well-being, you get little pictures like this. These are all relationships between things we care about and GDP per capita. And the only thing I want you to note is that there's very strong correlations. I'm not claiming that these are causal relationships, but the relationship is sufficiently strong between GDP per capita and things such as child mortality levels, life expectancy, educational levels, even things such as self-reported happiness. So this is GDP per capita in relation to self-reported happiness, the correlation between those. So this is basically across countries asking people, on average, how satisfied are you with your life? And this is the positive relationship that comes out. So why am I saying this when the point is to talk about inequality? Well, I'm mainly saying this as a defense of the very idea that looking at economic development would have any meaning even if you don't identify yourself as a sort of materialist first and foremostly. I myself do not do research in economics because I'm particularly keen on money, even though that seems to be the presumption. But that's not the case. I think that it is the strong relationship between economic development and things that are truly important that makes economics important. But that's a somewhat different story. Now, out of these different things when it comes to inequality, let's now look at what we know about the distribution of income. So, first of all, I should say that, or I will put this as a question also to just gauge how much economic history background you have. Over the past 200 years, what has been, how much has the world economy grown in sort of order of magnitude? Is a country today, is it like twice as rich as it was 200 years ago? Or is it 10 times as rich? Or is it more 100 times as rich? Twice, 10 times, or 100 times? Yeah.
Третий вариант.
Now, well, 100 times. Yeah, that's closer. Yeah. So, over the past, as long back in history as we know, economic development pretty much followed population development. So up until around the year 1800, economic development really, per capita terms, didn't move at all. As soon as we came up with ideas of, you know, how to cultivate the earth better or how to do things better technologically, the population grew. And then the population grew until those innovations were sort of nullified in terms of development. Now, 200 years ago, something extraordinary happens, but it happens in limited places across the globe. So we get massive economic development in some regions, but not everywhere. So order of magnitude, the difference between the poorest and the richest place 200 years ago, and I'm now speaking in per capita terms, the average difference was order of magnitude 5 times. Like the richest country was 5 times as rich as the poorest country on average. Now, of course, coming back to the inequality question, within countries, some people were immensely rich and others were very, very poor. But in average terms, the difference was not very large. Now, over the past 200 years, that difference has grown to an order of magnitude of 100 times richer. The richest country on earth is 100 times as rich as the poorest. So there's been a massive divergence. Now, what has happened to income inequality over this period? So here's a picture of a bunch of countries for which we have data since the late 1800s. And this is showing how much of all income measured in this GDP that goes to the top 1% of the population. So this is the richest 1 out of 100 people. How big a share of income do they get? Well, in the late 1800s, they got about 20% of all income. And surprisingly, or somewhat surprisingly to us at least when we started this work, was how similar this development seems to be over this period. Industrialization in most countries in Western Europe and in the US and, initially led to inequality being just as high as it had been before. But then in the early 1900s, inequality starts to drop in many countries. And it drops until around the 1970s, 1980s. And since then, it has increased in quite a few places. Not all, but a few. So there seems to be this kind of wave motion here, which some of you might have heard of Branko Milanovic. He's an economist with the World Bank who's written a lot about global inequality. And he speaks of something he calls Kuznets waves. Simon Kuznets was an economist who initially talked about a Kuznets curve, which was this part of the development, which was the idea that over the path of economic development, what happens initially is that industrialization brings a lot of opportunity, but initially only a few people can grab these opportunities, so initially inequality increases. But then, as progress plods along, then in the end, inequality starts to decrease because now everyone can take part in the new sector, so to speak. And this idea is important to keep in mind because this is exactly the same way that a lot of people are speaking about the current situation. So the idea is that information technology and digitalization brings opportunities that initially only a few people can really master, and they get fantastically rich. So this causes inequality to grow initially, but given time, this will, go away. So that's one line of reasoning around the recent increase in inequality. Yes, please.
Suren Petrosyan from Armenia. Thank you for your speech. And do you see any correlation between inequality and third wave of democratization, which starts from 1974? Any correlation between democratization wave, third wave of democratization, and inequality? Thank you.
So I don't know of any study that has looked at that in isolation. There's quite a few studies that look at democratization and inequality in general. And those studies, as far as I can recall, do not find very strong relationship between these. So in general, though, again, and this is somewhat technical in the sense that a lot has to do with the emphasis put on causality and causal relationships and the difficulty in finding that. If you look purely, if you're happy at looking at cross-sectional data, then for sure democracies are much more even in their distribution over time as well. So if you plot degree of democracy against inequality measures, then for sure democracies are much more equal than non-democratic countries. Now, the big debate is about whether it's democratization that causes the inequality to go down. Sometimes I think these discussions go too far in wanting to find the mechanics of these things, so that we lose track of what's a really important stylized fact, simply because some people say, no, there's no relationship has been proven. No, sure. Why? Because it's super, super difficult to find the mechanism that through which democracy gives lower degrees of inequality. It could be the other way around. It could be that, you know, lower inequality leads to more democracy. But the stylized fact is for sure that democracies are more equal than less democratic countries. Which, anyone interested, I'm happy to talk about this later, because this is one of the most fascinating things in looking at the history of ideas surrounding democracy, that in the many very liberal thinkers in the 19th century were very worried that democracy would kill economic development because of the effect that it would have on giving people that have no money voting rights. They thought that this would lead to them just appropriating all of the funds, which obviously did not happen, right? So, but let me go back to describing the development, and maybe we can come back to this very important question. Now, this idea of Kuznets that inequality is related to economic development in this inverse U-shape, Kuznets wrote this theory in the 1950s, and at that point it was a very obvious theory given how the data looked, right? So what he saw was truly what seemed to be an inverse relationship. Now, what has happened since is that if we look at economic development, which certainly did not stop in the 1950s, across countries we see instead a U-shape over the 20th century. So now all of a sudden, a lot of countries which are very economically developed have started to exhibit large increases in inequality. So this is very much related to the work by French economist Thomas Piketty, who's behind a lot of this data work, and who I've had the privilege to work with also in getting this historical data together. He's the one that really started this work on putting together historical data. And I want to point out two things by isolating three of the countries out of that maze of different developments. The blue line here is the US, the red one is France, and the green one is Sweden. So looking at this, first of all, it looks like a very homogeneous development. But if you look closely, you see that you can discuss different developments. So Sweden and the US share some parts, but France is different in other ways. So Sweden and the US, for example, share the fact that inequality has increased quite a lot over the past 20 or 30 years. Now, the difference, however, is that Sweden has increased from a much, much lower level of inequality. So, and this is something that I also want to sort of, this is an example of what you should pay attention to when reading about this in news or reading about this in reports. That it's one thing to have a change, but to assess what this means, you also need to be aware of at what level you start. Because in Sweden, for example, it's very popular to say that inequality in Sweden is as big a problem as it is in the United States. Why? Because inequality has increased as much in Sweden as it has in the United States. Now, a lot of journalists call me up and say, is this really true? And I say, yeah, it's true. But it's increased in Sweden from the level of the top 1% holding 4% of all income. And then it doubled. It sort of increased by twofold to the top 1% holding 8% of all income. Now in the US, they start out at the top 1% holding 10% of income. And that also doubled to the top 1% holding 20% of income. Now, is inequality equal in Sweden and in the US? No, of course not. The Swedish situation is more equal than what it was in the US when the US was at its most even. So, of course, you cannot look purely at the change over time, but you also need to take into account changes. Now, is it interesting that Sweden and the US exhibit a similar trend in this? Yeah, I think so. I think it tells us something, and of course we need to be aware of what's going on, but that's not the same as putting these as being similar problems across the two countries. Another particular thing about recent developments is the fact that a lot of the development over time actually happens in the very top of the distribution. So what does that mean? Well, a lot of theories around what drives inequality have to do with, say, education paying off, for example. So a lot of people talk about education becoming more valuable, or especially together with technological developments. Now, if education was the decisive factor for what drives inequality, then you would see the whole of sort of the top 10% at least of the population. So at least 10% of the population in these countries have higher education. By high, I mean university level education. What you see instead is that the increase is much more concentrated to a smaller group. So if you look at the picture to the right, you see small dotted lines that don't move all that much at all over the 20th century. That's the income share of the lower half of the top 10%. So this is like, if you take this row of people and you isolate the 10 richest people, or the 10 richest percent of the population, and you take the lower half of that, those are still people who belong to the sort of rich group, right? But their share of income doesn't move over the 20th century. Nothing's going on in that group. Everything is going on in the top one group. So if you want to formulate a theory for understanding this, that theory can, of course, include education, because most people in the top 1 are educated. But it's certainly not only education, because then you would see fluctuations in this broader group as well. Now, what is most stunning in this long-term development is that you see so little movement over the whole 20th century below the very top group. So there is something particular about a much, much smaller segment of the population. Okay? Now, I decided to include a couple of things about Russia in this, even though I have not done work on this myself. This is work by Thomas Piketty and Gabriel Zuckman and one of their co-authors. So this is, and I should say that this is just reporting what they claim to find. So the previous stuff I've looked at myself. That I can discuss and debate endlessly if someone has issues with the series. Here, this is more, using the same methodology, they look at Russia, and this is what they come up with. So basically, a couple of things stand out here as being similar, I guess, and that one thing is that over the 20th century, you see a very similar pattern in the sense that you have a sharp decline in inequality, basically from pre-1917 Tsarist times, and then a very flat development until the early 90s. And of course, here, I want to point out that it's very difficult to even conceptually think about inequality measurement in a planned economy such as the Soviet Union, because quite a few of the things that we try to measure here were simply not relevant in that kind of economic system. So that's an issue completely to itself. But this is trying to follow the same kind of methods used in other countries to give this calculation. However, there's one thing that happens after 1990, which also mimics what we see in many other countries. And that's the very sharp increase in shares for the top 10%. And if you look at that again and isolate the top 1%, you see the same kind of very sharp increase for a small segment of the population. And also, I wanted to add this because in this picture you see both the blue and the red line here are top income shares using this methodology where you look at the top 1 share of sort of all incomes generated. And the yellow line is what official survey data gives you. And so if you look at the best studies I know of inequality developments in Russia show relatively little in terms of increasing inequality. And, speaking with a little authority on the issue, not much, but I think that this is very much an artifact of missing a lot of the incomes for the top groups, right? People with more insight into this usually laugh and say, yeah, what else is new? Of course, that's the case. But this at least is interesting and important to recall when looking at the official developments and what comes out from different types of analysis when you try to capture all income. Now this is putting the Russian development next to some other countries. So in the picture to the left, Russia is the blue line there, and then you also have France and the US that you saw in the previous pictures. So you see that the top one share for Russia is really quite extreme, even in comparison to the US. And also, if you look at other East European countries, you see increases in the top one share in these countries as well, but those are also markedly smaller than what you see in Russia. Now let me go on to looking at this in a global context. This is changes in the Gini Coefficient, which is a measure of inequality. The higher that measure is, the larger is inequality. And this is a color-coded map saying something about the direction of change in that measure since the early 90s. So the greenish colors here mean that inequality has decreased. And the orange and reddish colors mean that inequality has increased. And the more red the color is, the more inequality has increased. So what we see here is that Russia, parts of Eastern Europe, China are the places where inequality has increased the most. But also most of Europe and the US and Australia, New Zealand, India, all of these places have experienced increasing inequality. Places that experience decreasing inequality have been Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. And globally speaking, this means that inequality levels have come closer to each other. There's a convergence in terms of inequality levels, even though differences are large still. But there's movement in that direction. Because this is a map of how unequal, what the levels are. So here you see that Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, those are the most unequal places still, even if inequality has been moving in the direction of more equality, those are still more unequal. So what about global inequality then? What has happened? If this is the picture that inequality is increasing almost everywhere, it's decreasing in some places where it's still very high. What's really happening to inequality globally? Now, this is a difficult question because you really have to think about what you mean by global inequality. So what I will mean here is, is inequality in the world if the world was one country. I'm not sure how well John Lennon references work in this audience, but you know, there's a song called Imagine There's No Country. That's the kind of world we're looking at here. So everyone lives in the same country. What would have happened to inequality in that kind of global country? So what has been the effect? Well, this is our best guess of what has happened. So what is this? This is real income changes across different parts of the global distribution of income. So this means that towards the left, you have all the really poor people in the world. And then as you move up, you get to the richer groups, globally speaking. And in terms of what order of magnitude we're talking about, the 50th, the median globally is a person who lives off something like $5 a day or so. So it's someone who's certainly above the absolute poverty line, which is at just below $2 a day. But it's certainly not a rich person by any standard. But that's reality. Still some, a little bit below 20% of global population lives below the absolute poverty line. And then there's quite a few people that live in the sort of $2 to $5 a day kind of range. And if we look at what has happened to the incomes of these very, very poor people globally, they have experienced income increases over the past 20 years or so. And this, of course, is due to very positive economic developments in China and India and places like this. So that's why, one of these lines is drawn without China, just to show how big the impact is from China and Chinese development alone. Now, over to the far right side, we see the development of people in Europe and the US, but who are, in our context, poor. So the working class, roughly speaking, in the US and in large parts of Europe, have really, on average, not seen a lot of income gains at all. And this is what's behind the increasing inequality in these countries. There's a lot of individual country differences, of course, but this is like the global picture. Most of that part is due to the development in the US. And this is also what a lot of people then think are behind certain types of political movements in terms of anti-globalization movements, of course, but also more nationalistic movements, that this is the sort of economic rationale for many of these movements is pointing to the fact that we have seen no real gains from this development. This can be debated and discussed, but this is one of the pictures behind that idea. Now, one thing that I wanted to point out also is that it's certainly not a trivial thing for the poorest people, globally speaking, to get large income gains. It's a big change, and it's a change that did not happen sort of over the past 200 years, but it has happened over the past 20 years. So it's a big achievement, I think, globally speaking. But at the same time, I think it's a bit disturbing when people say that the real winners of globalization have been the very poor people, because if you live on $1 a day, it really only takes $1 extra for you to have twice as much as you had before. So in terms of who has really gained, I think it's important to also look at the absolute values of these gains. And this is in fact the same picture as the previous picture. So this one, this is the same picture, but in absolute numbers, in absolute dollar terms. So now we see that the extremely rosy picture that you get from what has happened to the very poor really comes from the very poor starting off being quite extremely poor, right? So again, I'm not saying this to trivialize and to say that this is unimportant or that this is something that is to be considered as a small achievement, globally speaking. It's not. It's a big thing. But at the same time, I think it's important to keep in mind what the distribution of absolute gains is as well, because this is the same picture, but just painted in a different way. Let me just skip these things in the interest of time. Just want to at least make sure that we get to this picture, because even though I can give you a lot of facts about the development, that's nice, I guess, but you can get those facts in other ways too. So what I'd like to conclude with, and well, depending on how we do on time, we can discuss different theories about what has happened. But what I want to give you, at least, is a kind of framework to remember and to think about why the distribution of things matter for how we understand development. And this is the picture that I said is sort of similar to the one I showed early on, where at the top of this picture you have the initial distribution of things. This is the starting point for any discussion that we might have. This is what we start with. Partly this is in money terms, it's in education terms, it's our initial endowment of resources. Okay. Now, previously I said that this then determines sort of market actions or market outcomes. People do things based on their situation. They work, they study, they start a company, they do something. And this creates some outcome in economic and other terms, which determines how much you can save and how much you can invest for the next period. And then we get back to the distribution again. And so the economy works like this all the time, with some kind of distribution. Now, the important part here is that I've added a political sphere, where the initial distribution also influences the political process in multiple ways, right? So if we want to think about the fears of some of the thinkers in the 19th century who thought about democracy and why democracy would be a problem for economic development, their idea was that in a society with a lot of inequality, if you give the poor people voting rights, they would, of course, vote to confiscate all of the money from the rich people. And this would be the end of democracy and the market system and the end of private property and everything. Okay? Now, did this happen? Maybe it did in some countries, but certainly not everywhere. And certainly there was room for some negotiation between the elites and the people who got voting rights. But so I'm saying this just to highlight that the distribution, the initial distribution through the political process can have very important influence on what kinds of policies are enacted. Now there's a different way of thinking about that as well, because if you have a starting point when a lot of money is concentrated in the hands of very few people, it's pretty likely that they're going to influence the political process in ways which perhaps is not good for society as a whole, but for their interests. So this can also take multiple forms, but it's easy to envision, and this has been studied, in fact, at least in the US, that some lobby groups, for example, try to get through legislation that provides certain legal entitlements which are in their interest. Again, no big surprise. But in terms of how distributional issues are important, it's again through the distribution working through the political system and creating rules for the market interaction which are based not on having equal opportunity in that market, but having specific opportunities for those who have a lot of money to start with. And this kind of dynamic can then be very negative for the overall development. So this is yet another reason for both why inequality matters, but also for how it can influence the way society functions.